I'm going to change this to day 2. Yes, it is day 2. Here we go. That's more accurate. Hello, everybody. This is Scott Roberts from Sports Scientific and the Explorer Alliance. We're honored to be here at the Oracle Finale. Am I pronouncing it right? Finale Ranch House. That historic, beautiful, thick ability and all the rest of it. So we were able to get good internet down here thanks to Clint Branham. We've got our whole team here. Yesterday we had a doozy of a storm, okay, but late at night it did clear off, and I got a light meter reading, an S2M meter reading of 21.49, almost 21.5. So it was real dark and beautiful. I could see the Milky Way stretching. It was fantastic. We are going to kick off this event with David Levy, who was with us yesterday to read some poetry. So I'm going to switch over to you, David.
Hello, everybody, and those of you who made it to the Star Party, welcome. You don't know how unhappy I am that I'm not able to be there with you. It's tearing me up inside. It's actually tearing me up. At the moment, I cannot do it. However, I am here with you via Zoom and in spirit. I'm going to do 2 quotations right now. One of them is a piano piece. One of them is a piece, and you all hear me? I know
we hear you. Your camera went.
My camera.
Yeah.
I think it's coming back up.
There
Okay.
There you are. There you are.
Okay. Anyway, I have a couple of things for you this morning, and I wish you the very best. It looks like you're going to get bits and pieces of good sky. And later in the week, which is now, which is like Friday and Saturday, the sky should get quite a bit nicer. Anyway, I feel that I'm there with you in person. I really, really miss not being there. And the 2 things that I want to do. The first is a piano piece that I always love to play for Wendy. Of all the things that I bang out on the piano, this is her favorite, and here it goes. Were you able to hear that?
Yes.
Okay, that is Wendy's, that's that famous Bach piece that is Wendy's one of Wendy's favorite of all the things I can bang it on the piano. So they're staying with us. My granddaughter Summer is right here, and her fiance Ethan. I'm going to take them into the hospice, and then as soon as we're done here, we were just waiting for this meeting to get underway. And now for the quotation. Today's quotation is also one of Wendy's favorites, but this is from Romeo and Juliet. And did you know that this particular quote that I'm about to read is actually sitting on the moon right now? The Lunar Prospector spacecraft crashed onto the moon, and I think it probably made a gentle crash, and the piece of it with this quotation is probably still there. So I'm now going to read it to you. I'm not going to say it to you because I know it. It's from Juliet. And she says, she's giving a speech, she's saying words, and then she says, "Come, gentle night, come, loving black-browed night, give me my Romeo, and when he shall die, take him and cut him out into little stars. And he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun." Thank you all so much. And Scotty, if you want me to come back later this afternoon, just let me know. But we're going to head over to the hospice now. Thank you. And back to you, Scotty.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very sweet. Thank you. Okay, I feel that you're all with me, but I'd like to feel that, oh, there's the group. I'd like to feel that I'm with you as well. And I really wish I could be there. You don't know how much. It's just eating me up inside. Take care. And I hope you get a good night tonight, at least a partial night.
Okay, everyone, what we're going to do is we're going to transition to our speaker here. And I think that you might, John, Maritime. Okay, so John is someone that's been on our live shows before. He is someone that is incredibly active in protecting dark skies. And Dark Sky Consultant. John has been on national television. He's been quoted in magazines and has worked to protect dark skies around the world. And so we're really happy to have him. We are loading up your PowerPoint right now. So yeah. So those of you watching live, give us a few moments here, and we'll be right back with you. To my mark stuff, You're going to want to turn off all your audio. So we're gonna have new output. He's gonna be moving.
It's a little wobbly. I have ours at
We all set there, Ken? It reinstalled, so. Okay. It's okay.
Other people have problems.
At Starmus, there was a whole thing where, Brian May had showed up. And he was given like absolutely no time to rehearse. People had never performed before, and so he had one day to rehearse with all these people. And so, but they still pulled it all together. There were moments where we had to wait a little bit for different things, but it went through. Yeah, you should definitely go next year.
They look so.
Everybody that went to Starmus said their life, it was like life changing. Yeah. Yeah.
They don't let in different places every year. Yes.
They have so far, and I think they will next year too. So, but it was amazing to see the entire electric one. This thing, year event. We set up something called Starmus Camp right in front of the square. So they set up a professional stage, they had professional bands playing cold ones and classes. This was free. And roughly a third of the population, or the million people showed up. So I was crushed. I was just trying to show how this also works. And it was a lot of fun, but there was at one point where I had to like push people gently with my arms so I could get to the focuser of the eyepiece. So there were little kids looking down the tube. They were all around me. It was, if you're claustrophobic, this was not the place to be. But they were running towards the telescopes and science stations and stuff like that. Like, someone was dying. They had been so repressed for so long.
Yeah, probably never had anything like this.
Oh, they also, generations of people that were there said, no, we never ever had anything like this. So, it's fantastic. The entire city had LED display signs that were promoting Starmus, giant. All the rest of it. I've never been to an event that was promoted like that for. And
They have so many. That's
Yeah.
I tried.
maybe if the Rolling Stones had shown up in Paris and gave a free concert,
Right.
they might have had something similar. But, yeah, it was like that. This up in the musicians are fantastic. Blending of
So
music
that she
between rock and
I don't
jazz
know
and
if
soul.
you could understand my French.
Very unique stuff.
Wouldn't understand my French. At least. Exactly. We almost.
Okay. All right, Ken, so you can just start sharing your screen.
Let me mute myself.
And you're muted.
So I was in Paris, as long as I was talking to people in French, I was okay, that slowly.
Mike, do you want to give an intro to John?
No, that's all right. I was just gonna ask, does that keep over with this on the parking? So he's gonna have the plans.
Whether that's.
I need it for one computer. If we had another keyboard that was,
Yeah,
Wireless,
right. So
yeah.
he's gonna have actually next slide.
yeah, yeah. So Ken, you'll be advancing the slides. Yeah, once you go to stand here anyway.
field of view.
You can see, yeah, you can see kind of where you are. This one's, triple the tables.
That's all that worries me because I tend to.
Right. That's still under. Thank you. Yeah. You want to turn this one? It's ready. You guys, you got everything all? Okay. Okay. All right, so for right now, don't share your screen. Okay, let's let John talk for a little bit, and then he says, bring up my PowerPoint, and you can start sharing, because they'll take over the whole. Okay? Does this look okay for you guys too? You can see this, okay?
Would you want to?
Great, thanks for working through all this.
You want to turn this camera towards him?
He's gonna walk right up here, so, yep.
I'm gonna be in the field of view without, where should I be? Because I don't want to block the screen. too
Oh,
much
okay.
for the
Yeah, I
benefit
can
of
do
people
this.
over here.
Just like that.
I'm just gonna leave it up there. I've got it running.
I'll just ask you to advance. to the next
Yeah,
slide.
but just right now, unshare your,
No,
you can't unshare your
I'd rather
screen.
not. We have it up. Let's leave it up.
Okay, all right,
Zoom.
all right. Okay, all right, so anyways, pleasure to have you here, John. John Barentine is, of course, world famous for his work as a consultant for Dark Skies, but as I was reading your CV and resume and stuff like that, it goes on and on and on. You've done important, incredible work, in science and also in protecting dark skies, and also with the International Dark Sky Association. You were president of the organization at one point?
I was a director level.
Director
Yeah.
level, that's right. Okay. All right. So, well, without further ado, thank you, John, for being here at the Arizona Dark Sky Start Party.
Well, thank you, Scott, for inviting me. Thank you, Ken, Mike, people that have made this possible. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of a sideline for me. As Scott mentioned, my background is mainly in science, and I did astronomy for a long time before I came to doing predominantly dark skies. But having grown up here in Arizona, the history and the prehistory of this area have always been really interesting to me. And we're situated in the heartland of a lot of the prehistoric cultures whose material remains we still find around. So some of that case right over there, for example. Some pieces of pottery you might want to look at. So what I'm going to talk to you about over the next about 40 minutes or so is what's called the archaeoastronomy of the desert Southwest. So you'll advance the next slide for me, Ken. So when you hear me talk about archaeoastronomy, of course,
Yeah. I know, it's pretty large.
See, Steve, it's not just.
Well, may not be challenging.
That is, yes.
Here
There we go. Okay. So you're gonna hear me use this term archaeoastronomy repeatedly, and it is what you think it is. It's made up of two words. Part of it comes from the word archaeology, so we're studying the past. In particular, we're studying prehistory, where we don't necessarily have a written account of the people who left behind this history, and astronomy. So we're putting together those two studies to try to understand what people in the past, and specifically during prehistory, what they knew about the cosmos and what they thought about, as much as we can tell from the archaeological record. Can I have the next slide, please? There we go. Okay. So what I'm going to talk to you about is, first of all, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the best of our understanding of the science of astronomy in our current day based on astrophysics. So the sort of the Western view of astronomy and what that has been able to tell us. From there, I'm going to go into what motivates people to watch the night sky. And we start talking about the prehistoric people of this part of the world. What were the things that were important to them and lent themselves to an incorporation of this into their culture. I'm going to show you evidence of archaeoastronomy in the Southwest. So the specific examples where we see what we think are indications that ancient people were watching the night sky. I'm going to talk about the limitations of what those people could have known, and also our limitations on what we can know about them. So we can only infer so much based on the record that's left behind, and a lot of the rest of it becomes guesswork. And then I'll wrap up with a couple of what I call lessons from prehistory that we can get by examining this record very carefully. Next slide, please. So, as the song goes, it all started with a big bang. So this is the compressed view of astrophysics now. Things began about 13.7 billion years ago, and this event that you probably heard about called the Big Bang, which is the origin of essentially everything that we see in the universe. And this timeline that compresses all that history over there, mostly on the left, starts there and goes through the development of the first stars and the first galaxies, to clusters of galaxies, to individual stellar systems, and eventually we get to something like our own stellar system. We have good evidence for why the Big Bang is probably the right model that correctly describes the universe. For one thing, we see the fireball that was left behind. We see the cosmic microwave background is a key piece of evidence for the Big Bang. We see the universe expanding. It's hard to imagine a static universe that is also simultaneously expanding as we see it. And then there are ratios of certain elements in the early universe that are really difficult to explain without that fireball to make them in the original proportions. So this is why we think this is the right explanation for the universe as we see it. Next slide, please. So from the Big Bang, we had to assemble the pieces of the universe as we see them now. That meant growing galaxies, growing galaxy clusters out of that. And what we think is going on over the history of the universe has been a story of small things that coalesce into bigger things. So it was a bottom-up kind of approach in order to build big things like galaxies. How do we know this is the right model? We see galaxies merging in the local universe. So we know that's a process that's been going on for since almost the very beginning. Simulations like that group of images on the right, which show galaxies coalescing out of dark matter coupled with gas, predict the structure of the universe as we see it correctly. And there are certain properties of galaxies that we observe in the local universe that are explained by this. So this bottom-up method of putting together galaxies and galaxy clusters seems to be the way that we got to the universe as we see it today. From there, at the micro scale, we had to build individual stars. There's sort of a cartoon model on the left of how we do that by collapsing gas clouds, forming rotating disks in which are embedded what we call protostars, which eventually turn on into stars like the sun, for example. How do we know this is the right model that eventually gives us stars and planets? For one thing, we observe them now. These are pictures from the ALMA radio telescope array in the southern hemisphere that has such resolution that it's able to see these disks around very young stars, and it can even see the gaps in the disk that represent where planets are forming. There's a good concordance between the models and the observations, and there's really no other way that we know of building planetary systems like this. Next slide, please. So this is where we end up. This is our place in the cosmos. We have a good physical picture of how we got to this point. We see our Milky Way galaxy marching across the sky. We know we're embedded down in the disk of that galaxy. We orbit a very garden variety low mass star. We have a system of planets around the star. We're now finding lots of planets around other stars. Our story is consistent. Next slide, please. So how did we figure this all out? Next slide. We did it through curiosity, ingenuity, and the scientific method. These are mainly Western approaches to figuring out how the cosmos works, but it's not the only way of getting some of this information. That's what the rest of the talk is about. Next slide, please. So now, what motivated the ancient people who lived in this part of the world to look at the night sky? How did they develop their own cosmology, their own theory of how the universe works? Next slide. So there are a number of reasons why people in prehistory looked at the night sky. One of the least of the facts is it's half of the landscape. So whether it's during the daytime or at night, the sky, everything above the horizon is literally half of what we see. So if you're in a place like this, which is in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, and you're under a pristine natural night sky, this is long before electric light. So you've had beautiful views of the night sky like this. In addition to the foreground, which was more of a part of your daily existence, the nighttime was its own space, and it took up half of your field of view. So it's not surprising that this turned out to be important to the people who lived here in prehistoric times. It's also significant because night is half of the 24-hour day, right? We constantly live in a condition where about half of our lives are on the day side of the planet, the other half is on the night side. So you can see why this mattered to people. Again, in earlier times when we didn't have quite the same nature of the distractions that we do now, they weren't exactly looking at their phones all the time. That's where a lot of our folklore was born, essentially, at night and in that half of the sky that was perpetually above us. Next slide. So one of the reasons why it mattered to these people is that the heavens always seem to be inaccessible. It doesn't matter if you climb to the top of the tallest mountain that you can find, you don't seem to get any closer to the cosmos. And so that sets up a dichotomy between Earth and heaven. What I'm showing you here is a Navajo sand painting that shows Father Sky and Mother Earth as a set of opposing attributes of the natural world, right? In the same way that you have night and day, you have good and evil, you have up and down, lots of these different kinds of attributes come in pairs. So this was a natural pairing to say the Earth is a single domain and the heavens are a different domain, and humans don't have direct access to that upper world. So that lends itself to a lot of mythology and thinking that that's probably the dwelling place of the gods, for example, because it's fully cut off from the lowly human world down here. It exists in its own plane of reality entirely. Next slide. The other thing that motivated them was noticing that there were certain patterns in nature that recurred in a very predictable way. If the cosmos were a completely disordered and chaotic place, it'd be very difficult to figure out from one day to the next what was going to happen. But instead, they were able, even without modern measuring equipment, they were able to see the patterns in nature, and by studying them very carefully, they could use that to predict things that happen in the future. So as an example, what I'm showing you here, you may have seen a picture like this before, The dots in the sky are something called the analemma. So if you were to go out every day at the same hour of time and take a photograph of the position of the sun, and you did that over the course of the year, what you would find is that the position of the sun makes this elongated figure 8. If you're like me, you first encountered this on the side of a globe in elementary school and had no idea why there was a giant figure 8 on the side of the globe. It was trying to show this concept of the analemma, the apparent motion of the sun on the sky throughout the course of the year. And what's in the foreground, this is actually up the road in Phoenix. That's a very large architectural sundial. And so the photographer in this instance put these two things together to suggest the passage of time. So if you watch things long enough, not only can you see the shadows are moving during the day and defining the hours of the day, but over the course of the year, the position of the sun in the sky is telling you something about the seasons because this cycle recurs. And they knew very well about this cycle, even without the ability to take a photo of it like this. It's like this. So what motivated these ancient people ultimately to look at the sky? I think it comes down to 3 basic things. Bear in mind that the people who occupied the Southwest during prehistory were subsistence farmers. They spent most of their time working in land in order to provide for their people. They were preceded by earlier peoples in periods called the Archaic and the Paleo-Indian era, where it was mostly hunting and gathering. But even at that, you need to know sort of which plants are in season at different times, which animals can be harvested during different seasons. So once they settled down into agricultural communities, knowing the seasons was very important because your life depended on it. If the harvest failed because you didn't plant your crops at the right time, you could face an existential crisis very quickly, especially in this environment being so arid. The timing of crops has to be done almost perfectly. So that's one thing that motivated them. Religion was another. So as I said, they viewed the heavens as being distinct from the earth, and the heavens were largely the realm of the gods and inaccessible people. So for them, part of communing with nature and trying to understand the gods and their whims involved a need to understand what was happening in the sky above them. And we also know from the archaeological record that the prehistoric peoples of the Southwest engaged in quite a bit of warfare. So they were not altogether unlike ourselves. And if you had a competitive advantage against an adversary, you could use that in a way that might change the outcome of a conflict with them. So for example, the ability to predict a solar eclipse before it happens. If you know that that's about to happen and you launch your attack at just the right time, you might frighten your enemies who don't have that foreknowledge and think that something terrible is about to happen. It's about omens and signs that you read in nature. You could use that to your advantage if you knew that it was going to happen. And you could do that with this knowledge gleaned by watching nature for many, many hundreds of generations. So just like us, the ancient astronomers were trying to make sense of their world. And they did it with the equipment and the knowledge that they had at hand, that again was the sum of watching nature very closely for a very long period of time. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's the evidence? I said that there was astronomy taking place in the Southwest before the arrival of the Europeans. How do we know that? Next slide, please. So a little bit of context, especially for people that aren't from this part of the world. When we say the Southwest, what are we talking about? And who lived here during the prehistory? What I'm showing you over on the left is a map of mostly of what is now Arizona, New Mexico, a little bit of southern Utah and Colorado, so the Four Corners region, and parts of northern Mexico. We're a little bit to the right or the left and below the center of that map in Arizona right now. And what this shows you in the colors are the names and territory of some of the prehistoric cultures that we've been able to identify on the basis of the archaeological record. So the main thing that I wanted to point out is what we now call the Southwest in prehistoric times ranged essentially from the Gulf of California almost up to the Rocky Mountains. There was some settlement on the western side of the Colorado River in what's now California, but the Southwest sort of ended by the time you got to the plains of eastern New Mexico. And who lived here during prehistory? The important thing is it was not one monolithic culture. We think now of Native Americans, even though there are hundreds of individual tribes. even at that time, these are all very distinct cultures. They left behind a different archaeological record. So it's not like we're talking about one people. These are different people with different belief systems, different material culture, etc. Next slide, please. And this is, because it's small, this is kind of hard to read, but what I wanted to get across is the period of time that we're talking about. What I'm showing you here is a timeline that starts at the end of the last ice age on the left and it runs to modern times on the right. And overall, it's divided into two parts. That gray shaded area is what we would call prehistory. That's before the arrival of the Europeans in about the year 1540. That's when first Europeans arrived in what's now Arizona. And each of those colored boxes is one of those cultures that I showed you from the last slide. And the length of the colored bar indicates how long that culture seemed to have existed based on the archaeological record. And you'll notice by coincidence, we don't think there's any necessarily a cause and effect here, but a lot of those cultures were already on their way out before the Europeans arrived. So when the Europeans got here, they found a landscape that was a bit different than the set of cultures that I showed you from prehistory. There's some continuity between those ancient and now modern cultures that are suggested by the overlap of some of the colored bars. We have ethnographic evidence that there's a continuum between prehistoric cultures and their modern descendants who still live here in the Southwest. And we've been able to piece that together on the basis of genetic studies, detailed cultural studies, etc. The time scale here is nonlinear. I've compressed, 13,000, almost 15,000 years of history into this to show you that we're talking about a very long period of time and a slow evolution over much of that time until the arrival of the Europeans, which really changed the Southwest forever and made it what it is today. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show you three basic kinds of evidence to suggest that archaeoastronomy was taking place here in the Southwest. One of that is what we broadly call alignments. So physical structures that were built for purposes of occupation, for ceremonial reasons, etc., have preferred orientations in space that line up with celestial events in a way that can only be explained if it was intentional. There are just too many of them that are too perfectly lined up to say that it was all purely accident, or that they were aligning just to the cardinal directions, for example. So what I'm showing you here is a place called Casa Grande Ruins National Monument. It's just up the road. If you start heading towards Phoenix, you can be there in under an hour. And it preserves the remains of a culture that existed in central Arizona called the Hokan, which disappeared just before the arrival of the Europeans in about the year 1450. This structure is what they call a great house. It's a two-story adobe or mud brick building, dates to the so-called classic period, which is the last phase of the Hokan culture in the 14th century. And they built this canopy over it to shield it from the elements. It was found in a poor state of repair when the Europeans arrived. It's been restored closer to the way it would have appeared in its heyday. There are very few of these that survive. It's one of the best examples. Next slide, please. So if you look very carefully at the way the building is built, it's not quite oriented towards the cardinal directions. There's a slight offset. And by looking carefully at the structure itself, we figure out why that is. There are a number of apertures or openings into the building which were deliberate. It wasn't just a quirk of the construction, or some people speculated that some of the openings previously held log beams that had since decayed. There are openings that align to certain phenomena on the local horizons, the rising and setting of the sun on the equinoxes, on the solstices, the extremes of the seasons, even some of the alignments of the rising and setting of the moon. So it's been proposed that the Great House at Casa Grande was an early kind of astronomical observatory. The lower level of it seems to have been an occupied structure, but they did not find evidence to indicate occupation of the upper levels, and that's where most of the alignments seem to come in. So that this upper level of the building is really for the observations of these different events. Next slide, please. There's a place in Southwest Colorado called Chimney Rock that was recently dedicated as a national monument. This is was built by the Chaco culture They used to be called the Anasazi, which is a term that's kind of fallen out of use, or they now, it's preferred to call them ancestral Puebloans. This dates to somewhere between the 10th and 12th century, so roughly 1,000 years ago. And in the picture on the left, you can see that what's going on here is there's the top of a mesa in Archuleta County in southwest Colorado. And in the foreground here on the left, you can see a little square structure. There's a little stone ruin up there on the top of the mesa. And in the background are these sandstone pillars that are called the chimneys that give the place its name. And it has been shown that if you're standing in the position of the ruins and you're looking in the direction of the chimneys, the full moon rises between the chimneys only once every 18.6 years during an event that's called a major lunar standstill. It's a quirk of the moon's orbit around the Earth. So the position of the Pueblo cannot possibly be accidental, because you can only see this event from that location, from where the Pueblo is. If you're a short distance either way, you don't see it. The moon is hidden behind the chimneys. It's powerful evidence that this culture knew about this phenomenon and oriented this structure, put it there for this reason. Furthermore, there's no evidence that that Pueblo was occupied. People did not live there. They apparently only temporarily occupied it during these events when they would come from all over the Chaco world to witness this. The fact that they knew about this not only represents fairly sophisticated knowledge about the moon's orbit, but also because of the long delay between events, they had to pass this information down from generation to generation. The typical lifespan of these people was less than 30 years. So a person might see this once in their lifetime. And apparently it was a big gathering that came to pass when the standstills would be seen.
How often was that alignment? How is that?
This is a little less than 19 years, 18.6 years. Incidentally, the next time it's going to happen is in 2024. Make your reservations now. They're going to lead groups up to see it from Chimney Rock.
How close does that happen to the eclipse?
It's not close enough. It's in the fall.
Okay,
It's in the fall.
good. So I could go to the eclipse and do this.
You could, absolutely.
Okay.
Next slide, please. Some of you may have seen this example from Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, which was the heart of the Chacoan culture. It's called the Sun Dagger. It's on the side of a natural land feature called Fajada Butte that dates to, again, somewhere between about the 10th and the 12th centuries. There is, on the side of Fajada Butte, there is a set of 3 slabs of sandstone that fell naturally from the erosion of the rock sometime in prehistory. And the way that they landed lined up well enough with the sky that at certain times of the year, the beams of sunlight would pass through the spaces between them and would cast these bright beams onto the rock behind them. And so what the Chacoans did was they observed that at certain times of the year, such as around the solstices, a narrow beam of light would pass through a certain part of this rock face behind it. So they went up there and they carved a spiral onto the rock. They also carved an outer spiral. You'll see in the set of diagrams right here, which shows the spiral, shows this beam of light on the different occasions. And then all of the examples on the bottom row right there, that dark gray shading represents the light or shadow from moonlight. And guess what? The 18.6 year major lunar standstill is represented as one of the alignments. They didn't start out necessarily with the knowledge. They knew that there were these certain special times in the calendar of seasons. And by carefully watching this, once they knew that the phenomenon was happening, all they had to do was mark the rock. And by doing that, they could anticipate the solstice weeks ahead of its occurrence. So again, if you have to watch the seasons very carefully to know when to plant, and something is giving you forewarning that an important date is about to come up, again, this is existential. This is part of your ability to provide for your people. So again, very sophisticated knowledge where they took advantage of a natural alignment in the rock in order to create a calendar. Next slide, please. The other kinds of evidence that we have are what we call material culture. So the physical objects that a culture leaves behind. Examples here are ceramics on the left that were made by the Hohokam culture here in central and southern Arizona that have star motifs on them. Why do we know that these were stars and not some other symbol? That has to do with the cultural continuity by talking to the people who are the descendants of the Hohokam who still live in the area. We have some sense of what the interpretation is. There's another example over here on the right, in the Navajo culture in northern Arizona, what's called sky ceiling. So there's a rock overhang onto which have been painted a lot of these little cross symbols, which were intended to be stars. So this, if not a map of the sky, it was a representation of a starry sky. So we see this in their culture that they left behind. Next slide, please. If you go to Chaco Canyon, you might get to see this very famous, what's called a pentagraph, where they have painted onto a rock surface near this place called the Peñasco Blanco ruin that was inhabited in around the 11th century. This has become famous. You open up any introductory astronomy textbook, they will show this as an example of ancient astronomy. The picture on the rock shows a star symbol, a crescent moon, and a handprint. The handprint is kind of like the artist's signature. If you're standing, and it's on a surface that's above the person who's seeing it. So you have to be up there to be able to paint the surface. And what this is thought to represent is the emergence of a supernova that from European and Chinese sources we know appeared on the morning of July 4th in the year 1054 and resulted in the Crab supernova remnant. So the Crab nebula that you see over there on the right. Next slide, please. So if we look at that, now I've flipped it over, so we have it now from the perspective of somebody who stands on the ground and looks up at the rock panel and then looks ahead of them to the east on the morning that the supernova occurred. The supernova is the bright blob there in the center, and there just off to the left and below it is the crescent moon. So it's indirect evidence, but it's strongly suggestive. And how do we know that it was right place at the right time? Some years ago, some paint chips fell from that pictograph and were carbon dated to the 11th century, contemporaneous with Pueblo on top of the mesa. So we have the right place. Somebody could have seen the scene of the supernova and the crescent moon on the morning it appeared, and the paint dates to the right period of time. That's not an airtight case, but again, strongly suggestive. Next slide, please. There's also a pictograph or a petroglyph, excuse me, a carving into the rock. This is near the Unavita ruin, also in Chaco Canyon. This was only relatively recently discovered, about 10 years ago. And it's hypothesized by McKim Malville's group, the University of Colorado, that circle with the kind of little swirls coming off of it is a representation of a totally eclipsed sun. And it turns out that from that very location, in July of 1097, a total solar eclipse path passed directly over Chaco Canyon. Again, right place, right time. And then the swirls are an impression of the solar corona seen during the mid-eclipse. There's even, if you'll notice in the picture in the lower left, off to the upper left of that picture, there's another blob. It's hypothesized that that's the planet Venus. So in the lower right, that's a planetarium simulation of the eclipse from Chaco Canyon. And at the time, about 40 degrees away in the sky was the planet Venus. That would have been visible during totality. Next slide, please. There are a number of what have been come to be called meteorite barriers that have been found in some of the ruins in the southwest, where iron meteorites, mainly from the Meteor Crater near Winslow, Arizona, were found in context in ruins, and in some cases seem to have been deliberately buried. We know that because the Winona burial over on the left, when this was found in the 1940s, there was the remnant of a feather blanket wrapping around the stones, which is the same thing that has been found in the context of infant burials in the same culture. We don't know if the people who put them there understood the connection to the sky, because Meteor Crater was probably formed roughly 50,000 years ago. And we have no reason to believe there were people in what was the New World at that time. But they would not have found native iron anywhere in nature other than through meteorites. So whether they were thinking there was something special about this, they didn't see this one fall. But did they see others fall that they then buried, thinking that again, the separation between the lower world and the upper sky, that these were material objects that had come from the sky, from the realm of the gods, and they accorded them that status. Next slide, please. And then the third piece of evidence that we have is what we call ethnographic information. So that's the link with modern Native Americans. Of course, there's a lot of influence from European cultures after the first contact with Europeans when they arrived here, and that has had an influence on the culture of Native Americans. But we find a lot of information that seems to have come down without a lot of alteration. So by piecing together the modern Native American tales and stories about the sky, we gain inferences about what their historical predecessors might have believed. So we put all this together, and that gives us a pretty strong indication that, that they really were interested in astronomy. Next slide, please. So what are the limitations of all this ancient knowledge? We've been telling you about this kind of sophisticated view of nature gained through a lot of observation. They understood things like the major lunar standstills, but why is it that they could not have had a view of the cosmos like we do now, like I presented in the very beginning? What differentiates these cultures? Next slide, please. Well, for one thing, there's a lot that the ancients could not have known about the universe. They could observe with their eyes, but they did not have telescopes. They didn't have sensitive instruments. You know, for the most part, the Europeans didn't either. It's not to suggest that there's something inferior about the prehistoric peoples of the Southwest. Their access to technology was approximately what Europeans had at the same time. It was not all that different. But in any culture that's restricted to those very basic observations of nature, there's a limit to what you possibly can know. So they got the things like the alignments really well, but they could only speculate on, you know, what is the sun? What is the moon? What are the stars? With very limited knowledge about their physical nature. And without any physical input to that from data, you're left to sort of speculate on what that can be. And when you add on top the religious element, a lot of it was just thought to be beyond the ability of human comprehension. It was something that the gods knew and understood, but it wasn't for human beings necessarily to know. Next slide, please. There's also a limit in terms of what we can know about those people, largely because, as I mentioned at the beginning, they are prehistoric in the sense that they left us no written record. There's every reason to believe that they had language, certainly, but they did not have a system of writing that has come down to us. And by the time the Europeans arrived, they did relatively little to try to collect information about them in that sense. They weren't very curious in that sense about the people whose lands that they were invading. And so whatever languages existed at the time were not preserved. So all we have is what they left behind. All we have is their material culture, the alignments of their buildings. And then we supplement that with this ethnographic information that helps fill in some of the gaps. But ultimately, you know, we have to make some guesses. Like I said, for example, with the Crab Nebula pictograph at Chaco Canyon, it's a circumstantial case. It's right place, right time. And we work from that, but there's certainly a possibility that we've got it wrong. That the people who made that painting had something completely different in mind. Maybe that was just a bright star and it wasn't a supernova. But it seems to me that an event that would have been so noteworthy at the time, because that supernova would have been the brightest thing in the sky other than the sun and the moon for months, would have gotten the attention of those people now, and that they would have wanted to commemorate that. Next slide, please. So we have to be worried then about if we are imposing our own view of the world and the view of history on interpreting this information. Are our own biases feeding into this? Do we want to believe that that's the Crab Nebula supernova, whereas it was not? And there are people who are very skeptical of this still. Some other examples, like the one in the lower left, which is from near Flagstaff, Arizona, which purport to be supernova crescent moon combinations. People like Edwin Krupp, who's the director of the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, an archaeoastronomer of great renown, is completely skeptical about these. He basically says, I'm certain that star crescent combos have nothing to do with the event before that. That's a level of certainty I don't think that Ed can claim, even though he would like to. But it just reminds us that we should be careful about not over interpreting the data that we actually have access to. Next slide, please. So the last little bit here before I close is what I call the lessons of prehistory. We boil this down. What can we say with some degree of certainty? Next slide, please. Things came to an end in an unfortunate way. And I showed you that picture earlier that had the timeline with all the cultures. And I said, by chance, a lot of these cultures came to an end just before the Europeans arrived. That was in part because of deteriorating environmental conditions here in the South. There was a significant drought that began in the last quarter of the 13th century and lasted until about the year 1300, 25 years long. By the end of that time, the population of the Southwest was decimated, and these cultures began to reorganize. We don't know the details. We think there was conflict. People probably starved. They did not do very well with things like crop rotation. They didn't have modern agricultural techniques, and so crops began to fail. All we know is that by the end of the 13th into the 14th century, and just before the Europeans arrived, the population in the Southwest has dropped by about 90%. And they have started to move around. Next slide, please. There is continuity, however, as I mentioned, that we've identified some of the modern descendants of these ancient peoples. When I was a kid growing up in Arizona, taught Arizona history in school, we were told that they just disappeared, that the Europeans showed up and they found all of these abandoned cities. And that's a nice story, but it's not true. They did encounter their descendants. What they did was they reorganized. So these are maps of the Four Corners region showing how the populations moved around during this time of exceptional drought. Incidentally, the Southwest is now in a drought that's comparable to the scale of that in the 13th century. So right away, one of the lessons is water is a precious resource here. And if you don't manage it properly, the same thing can happen to your society. I don't think we are any more secure than they were, to tell you the truth. But the important thing is that the Native Americans didn't disappear. They became new cultures. Next slide, please. So one of the first lessons is that the ancients had to be very careful observers of nature. This is just too sophisticated of an interpretation here of seeing these lights and shadows on the rocks for that not to be what it was meant to be. It was a calendar device, and it was meant to keep very careful track of the seasons. So when they looked at nature, they saw predictable cycles. They saw that it would benefit them if they followed those cycles and used them to then tell them what was going to happen down the road. It was part of their survival. Next slide, please. Their keen observation of nature resulted from their complete dependence on it. You know, they couldn't run down to the grocery store when the cupboard was getting bare. They had to live off of what the land provided them. I think that still in the Native American culture, there's a healthier relationship between people and environment, between people and land, than there is in Western cultures, which tend to be more of the mindset that the land and the environment is something to exploit, and that the resources are endless. But what this prehistory shows us is that's not the case. And as soon as things get out of balance, it could spell the end of your society. Next slide, please. So these people were able to take that information and exploit it for their benefit. Here's yet another alignment at a national monument called Hovenweed in southeast Utah on the border with Colorado. Another set of alignments, so light coming in through apertures in walls and projecting images that line up with the equinoxes and the solstices, and that they use this information to their advantage. And able to do that for a very, very long time. Probably back to the beginning, when the very earliest people came into the New World, they already had this knowledge. We don't find a lot of material culture left over from the earliest people. It's sort of been erased from the environment because of erosion and developments and things like that. But this had to be transmitted down through the generations. And they did this successfully for on the order of about 10,000 years. Next slide, please. And in the end, it was the religious beliefs and their cultural practices that helped them make sense of their place in the cosmos. And to tie this back into what I was talking about at the very top with the modern view of astronomy, their motives were like ours. We want to understand where we came from, how do we fit into this bigger picture, what's the story up to this point, what can we learn by observing nature very carefully. And I think it's a really tremendous testament to these people that they were able to do this with such limited technological means and to do it so long and so successfully. And there are things that we can learn by thinking about this very carefully. And I think that's one more. I think that's my last slide. With that, I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions. Yes, sir.
Well, first, thank you. That was very interesting. I appreciate it. Really all the. I have one question, and perhaps I missed it. What was the advantage of being able to predict that the moon would be seen every 18.5 years between perspectives?
That's a great question. And I think the short answer to that is that was probably of purely religious or ceremonial interest to them. I don't think that there was any cycle in nature that they depended on knowing when that happened. But because it was so infrequent, odds are, and again, they only occupied that site during that time. It was probably related to something in their religion, and they treated it like a religious festival, given that they came from all over the Chacoan world to see that phenomenon.
When do you think the site was built?
The site was built in about the 10th to 11th century, or at least it was inhabited during that time.
It was more of a coincidence that the site was built there, and then somebody happened to see the moon.
Absolutely, absolutely. Would not have suggested that. They predicted, they said, you know what, I bet if we went to that mesa, we could see this thing. Somebody had to have been there and noticed it, but then also noticed that it recurred on this very long time scale. And once they saw it at least twice and realized, okay, if we come back in another almost 19 years, we'll see it happen again. So they probably went there for other purposes, noticed that the phenomenon was happening and said, this is a special place, and chose to make that a temporary ceremonial center. Okay.
Is there any evidence that they made what they call graphs of irregular events or, well, them, I guess, we've seen irregular comets?
I have seen suggestions made of certain rock art representing comets. It's difficult to tell because there's ambiguity in the symbols. I mentioned that with the like the images of pottery. The reason that we interpret those cross signs as stars is that the modern descendants of the Hohokam tell us that's what the symbol means. Of course, you know, they've been affected by 500 years of colonization, so their interpretation may have changed over time. It would not surprise me in the least if they did. The difficulty is in lining that up with any particular comet. It's really hard to put dates on things unless you have something like the occupation. So, you know, I mentioned in several of these cases that there was the Pueblo nearby was occupied during the same period of time. But if we wanted to say this depiction is a comet, and it's this comet that was known from the Chinese observers have been seen in this year, it would be really difficult to get down to that level. But I think you're right. Any night sky phenomenon that was unusual, and especially that was bright, would have been of interest to them. And I can't imagine that they would want to preserve that.
Were the meteorites that were basically, I guess, buried, were those chondrites or were those metallic? Because I would be hard to say that when a meteorite largely exploded and came down, unless you were right under it and could actually listen, hear, feel the falling debris, unless it was a metal one, because they had no metal. I don't know. I don't see how those could be regular stone meteorites.
The majority of the meteorite burials are irons, and of those, almost all of them are the King Diablo, the meteor crater iron. Okay. But there are stony meteorites that have been found in meteorite barriers. And that strongly suggests that they saw them fall. Because otherwise, with a little bit of weathering, you can't tell a stony meteorite apart from a terrestrial rock. So what that says to me is they must have seen that fall and went and recovered the rocks. And that would establish, because you're right, they could say, well, iron is unusual. We don't know where this came from, but it's a precious material and we'll treat it that way. But it's harder to explain things when you find chondrites in meteorite burials because they would otherwise look like earth rocks.
Yeah.
So why would they have something inside?
Was there evidence of other great rocks being buried or is it specifically meteorites?
No, I've never heard of any other kind of rock being treated that way. They did use rocks as resources for example, they would collect hematite and grind it down into powder and use it to make red paint for painting pottery. But they never treated hematite as a ceremonial object. They never buried it like they did with the meteorites, which again suggests a knowledge of this, whatever this is, it is special in a way that all other rocks are.
I have a question that you probably have gotten before. We have all of this evidence of all of these light columns, and windows, and this and that that line up exactly on something. How many are found that missed by a day, a week? You would think statistically there would be far more that missed it than there would be that got it.
So the famous examples are really close. I don't know that I can answer that because I think a lot of them have been overlooked. And it may be the case that they are overlooked because they didn't get it quite right. The question is, did they need to know to the exact day when the solstice occurred? Or was it good enough to know it was within, say, a week? And that might have been good enough for them. The famous examples, I think, are famous because they're so very clearly of that function. And if you go to Fajada Butte, the dagger goes through the center of the spiral only on the day of the solstice. And as long as there's some effect with the precession of the Earth's orbit that over a long period of time, that's going to begin to wander a bit. But even more than 1,000 years after that was created, it's still very repeatable and very reliable. But that's a good point. I think for most of them, it wasn't necessary to get it precisely right as long as they were close.
So on with the dagger one, was that done? Is that like in the morning that it does that, or is it like high noon?
It's around noon. Yeah, it's around noon. But you find where there are things like the sun dagger elsewhere in the Southwest, if they used a natural land feature like the slabs of rock, you just kind of had to work with whatever you had, and the image would appear at the hour that it did. As long as it was, again, within a few days, it was probably good enough for their purposes. But no, we know of situations, it's not necessarily just noon or some other important time of day, which is unfortunate because we think probably there were times of day that were important to them, just like they are to us. But there are very few of these calendar devices. They didn't use sundials. That's a funny thing, right? Because a sundial is in lots of cultures in the world. We don't see evidence of sundial type structures where they were recording the hours of the day, but the days of the year seem to mean a lot.
How does precession fit in with these language discussions?
Yeah, over time, because the Earth's axis processing, things are eventually not going to line up quite as well as they did, but it'll come back around given enough time. But considering that the period of precession is about 24,000 years, and we're talking about one or two parts in 24,000, we've not yet seen precession start to really make them inaccurate, but eventually it'll start to have that effect.
Could it be that the sundials, we don't see them here in ancient culture, maybe because they had not become in cultures where there's lots of building and other things going on, art, science, all that kind of stuff. There's probably not that. It's just like get up in the morning, do the crop and get back to bed.
Yeah, they would have, I think mainly have been governed by the rising and setting of the sun. That would have set the activity cycle for the day. There are what are known as sun watching stations. We see these in ancient ruins, and there's a continuity with the Navajo and the Hopi engage in sun watching. There may have been some effort to try to figure out the hours in the day, but these sun watching stations are kind of odd. They look like almost like thrones, like these stone seats almost, where the observer would have been positioned, but there doesn't seem to have been anything around them. So we still don't quite understand how that worked. And in certain instances, when you try to work with modern Native American tribes, there are things they don't like to talk about with non-Native people. And the details of the sun watching ceremony are something that seems to be fairly closely guarded. And in any case, because again, you add all the years of European contact onto that, the nature of the Navajo sun watching ceremony now is probably not the same as it was to their predecessors 1,000 years ago. So it's hard to infer too much out of it.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, John.
Thank you again.
I want to mention before you go, John is the author of 3 books on the history of astronomy. And I actually had to pull up this webpage to remember the books here. The Lost Constellations, Uncharted Constellations, and the Mystery of the Ashen Light of Venus. So that's
I've read all 3 of those and they are
right.
wonderful.
And you're a native to Tucson. You worked in professional astronomy here. You have a PhD in astronomy. So you know, it's again, it's a real honor to have you here at our event. And thanks for an amazing presentation. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Great. Okay. So up next, yep. Up next is Mike Wiesner. Now, Mike, I gave you introductions yesterday, but Mike has worn many hats in his life. He's written a book about his life, which of course you can get here at this event. And you can also buy it online through explorescientific.com. He was a jet fighter pilot. He studied astrophysics. He took many twists and turns in his life, all leading up to the Arizona Dark Sky Star Party. And his, you know, he is again a protector of dark skies. That is the theme of this event, and we hope to play some small role in helping the whole community of Oracle become a dark sky place. So that is our goal, and you know, so it's wonderful that you're all here in person, and for all of you guys that are watching this presentation streaming live right now, we want to thank you for tuning in. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike. I know he has a presentation about how to get astro photographs with your smartphone, which I did last night. So, right. So we did have clear skies last night, about 2.
Yeah, the post was at 3. So.
Yeah, I posted it at 3, but I was up there looking at all the sky and seeing the.
It is dark.
Yeah, it is.
It is dark.
I took a SQM meter reading of nearly 21.5 last night. So very nice. Anyways, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Yeah, you're going to learn a lot if you haven't done this before. So
before I get into this talk, I want to give you a little bit about this Oracle dark sky heritage that you've kind of heard about. Back in 1916, over 100 years ago, a resident of Oracle gave an anonymous donation to the University of Arizona down in Tucson to create an observatory. Big telescope, big building, all that. $60,000 back then was a heck of a lot of money. Well, after this lady passed away, it was okay then to say what her name was. Well, it was Lavinia Stewart from Oracle. That became Stewart Observatory. So little kind of just a history of this area. In 2016, the university had a 100th anniversary celebration of her gift to create the observatory. And Oracle also had a celebration. We had a celestial concert here. Adam Block was one of our speakers, and you'll hear from Adam this afternoon. I was one of the speakers. We had a Jesuit priest in the Vatican Observatory give a talk about the astronomy of the Christmas star. What made sense to make the very bright light in the sky. Concert, pianists, community people all came to that event. So that's that kind of this long-reaching dark sky heritage for this community. In 2014, as many of you know from yesterday, we got this park designated as an IDA International Dark Sky Park. I direct your attention over to what we call our dark sky corner. You will see the IDA award being designated as an International Dark Sky Park. Also, you will see an IDA Sky Defender Award, Dark Sky Defender Award there. And John Barentine presented that to the Oracle Dark Skies Committee, getting this park designated as an International Dark Sky Park. So lots of history over there. There's also some IDA brochures on light pollution. Feel free to grab some of those. We'd love to have you take those with you, share them with your friends and your relatives. Okay, so let's go ahead and get on to my talk. Go ahead and share your screen there.
We'll see how this goes. I appreciate the shot.
So yeah, we're going to talk about some of that stuff you see on there. Next slide. So who am I? Well, you've heard a little bit about me. Next. So I've been an amateur astronomer ever since I was 6 years old, 1954. An older brother took me out in the backyard, showed me the sky, and he specifically pointed out to me the constellation of Cassiopeia. And part of the time it's an M, part of the time it's a W up in the sky. Those are my initials. And he told me that. So when I got my permanent observatory at the Oracle, that's called Cassiopeia Observatory. I also became famous for running this EDTX telescope site that began in 1996. That's the time frame that I first met Scott. Spent a few hours in his office and me instruments down in Irvine. Signed a few non-disclosure forms. Those were fun days. Those are fun days. Next one. So I got an astrophysics degree from Indiana University in 1970. Next. I was an Air Force A-17 pilot and a T-38 fighter instructor pilot. Did my A-7 training down here in Tucson. That was in 1974. Came back 30 years later and bought my was manager on the Air Force Space Shuttle program. Next. I was a senior manager, my last job, large aerospace company out in Southern California. Next. I purchased my retirement land here in Oracle in 2004 with my wife, Lorraine. And we actually got moved here in 2009. In middle of 2007, my boss at this very large aerospace company said, I can't afford you anymore. So go away. You can take early retirement at 59 and a half. First call, hey wife, guess what? Financial planner, can I? Yes, bye. So we moved to Oracle, built my own little observatory here, got a mead telescope and star stuff. Okay, so just a quick thing about this. I was interviewed by Arizona Illustrated, which was done by the Tucson PBS station back in 2017. And later on it aired in other places. Adam Block also had a segment of this. He had like the first week show and then I had the second week show. Next. Bingo. It was nominated for an Emmy Award when I started. It was nominated because of the producer and the videographer that I was just on. Talk about getting a kick. Really something. Okay. And you can watch that. It is online. You can go search for it. It's also on my website. Next. Do this plug. My autobiography is over there. You can buy that 15 bucks. The proceeds from it go to Explore Scientific to help pay for the event. So I'm not collecting any royalties. Everybody kept asking me, we want to know more about you. Put little sort of histories up on my website, some very basic information. We want to know more. So I said, okay, I'll write my autobiography. I don't want to just tell you about me. I want to tell you about you. I wanted this one. What's the magic word? Silence. I didn't want the book necessarily to be about me. I wanted it to sort of be your endorsement. You made the right decisions in your life, if you're all like me, or you give it to your kids or your grandkids as a roadmap for what they might do through their life. Because as when you read my autobiography, I went this way, this way, this way, this way, and lots of successes, lots of failures, and I document all that in ups and downs, everything. It's all in that book. But it's there to be this guide, or it's there to be something that tells you you made the right decisions as well where you've been. So if you want to read, fine. Okay, whoops, okay. So moving on. Is that the next one I want? So disclaimer. I like to tell everybody I just play astrophotography. But that works well for me for doing astrophotography with a smartphone. I don't spend hours and hours and out there collecting photons, and I don't spend hours in the computer doing post-processing. I don't generally stack images. And like I said, that's why I use a smartphone and a DSLR. Next. So I actually did some early astrophotography. Next. So back in 1961 Christmas, my mother gave me an Edmund Scientific 3-inch telescope. Many of you may have had something from Edmund Scientific way back when. And next, I had a series of total lunar eclipse photos published in my hometown newspaper right on the home page. So that was kind of key to me as a teenager. Next. Oh, boy, this is really small. So most of you already know, but we're going to kind of go into the basics about astrophotography as it's going to eventually apply to smartphones. We'll know what you need. We're going to talk about the adapters for the smartphones, and I brought a couple of examples with me. I'm going to step through a bunch of examples very quickly, just to give you a taste of what you can capture with a smartphone. We'll talk briefly about video recording astrophotography, talk very briefly about some smartphone apps, give you a whole slew of tips, because there's a bunch of things you really need to know to do good smartphone photography. Briefly talk about some editing, and then we'll go around. Next. Suggest you also see Astronomy Magazine, November 2021 issue. They asked me to write an article about smartphone photography, so some of what I'm going to say here is also in that article. Next. Also, this just recently came out from NASA, a guide to smartphone astrophotography. Got lots of great information written by Dr. Sten Oldenwald. A lot of good technical information, a lot of basic information, but there's limited iPhone information. I'm not surprised about that. Many of the examples that he showed are from very old models of iPhones. You see in my talk, I've got a whole range of older iPhones up to more current ones. And it's free. And there's a link there. We've also done some Explore Alliance live shows, so you can find those on the Explore Alliance website, where I talk about smartphone. Next. So basically, just quickly we'll step through this. So what is astrophotography? You all know it. Photography is basically anything up in the sky, but you can do photography with a smartphone and the galaxy. Next, development of astrophotography equipment began back in the mid-1800s. They used metal photographic plates. Next. Fast plates started being used in the 1900s. And of course, roll film started being used by amateur astronomers in the mid-1900s. Next. All those expensive CCDs started out at the professional observatories in the 1970s. Next. Of course, as the price of those dropped, many of you probably started jumping into CCD astrophotography with their telescopes around the 1900s. Digital cameras started coming out, consumer models, people started taking astrophotography with them. I jumped on one of the very early models of digital cameras, 640 by 480 kind of an image, low res JPEG and all that. I started doing astrophotography and migrated to the cell phones, which really showed up big time when the iPhone came out in 2007. But even some of the prior cell phone models had cameras on. And talk about that in a second. Next, okay, so what do you need to do this smartphone astrophotography? Well, it's going to depend. Next. We're going to look at some examples of astrophotographs of the Swan Nebula or Omega Nebula. This is 17. Next. So if you've got a couple $1 billion, not including operating expenses, use the Hubble Space Telescope, and this is what you'll get of M17. Next. You got just a few hundred millions of dollars, go down to Chile, get all other big scopes, and that's what the image is gonna look like. Next. You got just a few millions of dollars, you can remember the Kit Peak, grab one of their telescopes and get a picture like that. Next. This was actually a setup by Robert Weiss, who was at the 2019 Arizona Dark Sky Star Party across the caverns, and he gave me permission to use his photograph and a photograph of his gear. So again, that's about $8,000 worth of gear. Next. Or pictures like Mike had done with the DSLR on my 12-inch beam telescope out of my observatory. Not too bad for DSLR. Next. Or an iPhone, let's say, telescope. So, kind of want to give you an example. You still see the swan shape very clearly there. You get some color, hints of the color. So that's what you can do with what you will probably already have. And that's not going to cost you that $2 billion. So, next. So just real quick, kind of the illustration of various sensor sizes. The big dedicated imagers, very large, your typical consumer level full frame or top frame sensors, all the way down to the small little rectangle that's your smartphone. That's the size, comparison size of the sensor. Next, not that that's going to mean anything for what we're going to do. I just throw it out there. So what do you really need? Well, depends on what you're looking for. Next. We already got. Next. Next. There we go. So as I kind of been alluding, digital cameras, SLR, point and shoot, great for astrophotography. But if you got a smartphone, you can already become an astrophotographer. So we're going to just concentrate now on smartphones. So, next. So yeah, today's cameras are amazing. So that's my observatory. That's the moon being projected up onto the dome through the telescope. And in the background, you can see some stars. So the picture on the right, that's the Pleiades over there at the right edge. So we got the Pleiades, we got the Perseus constellation, and moon being projected on the clouds. That's just handheld. It's not on a front. Next. So types of photography, simple night sky photography, you can do it with a smartphone. You can mount your phone on a tracker of some sort or piggyback. You can do that. Prime focus, though, you cannot do without breaking your camera from breaking your phone. You'd have to pull the lenses off. And typically, you don't want to do that. However, there's a guy down in Chile, I think it is, who took his Android smartphone, disassembled it, pulled all the lenses off. So now he's sending data directly to the sensor. And he's done some special stuff. And he gets some pretty fancy stuff because he's talking directly to the sensor. So we're not going to go that far. We're going to keep it simple for you. Info. Well, that's really what you're going to end up doing. Put your smartphone right on your eyepiece. We'll talk about how you don't do that. And then you can do eyepiece projection for photography, but again, you'd have to take the lens off of your smartphone. Not gonna do that. Next, okay. Next thing. So I do point out that I was not the first smartphone astrophotographer. My ETX site did have a lot of submissions, mostly the moon, where people took those little flip phones or whatever it was that they had back in the early 2000s and middle 2000s, and took some pictures. Next. Of course, Steve Jobs, the CEO, introduced the original iPhone in January 2007, and the cell phone landscape changed immediately, although the cell phone companies didn't believe it would, but it did. So this was, I think, the first ever iPhone astrophotograph that was done on Christmas Eve using a small 70mm refractor ETX70 with a 9mm eyepiece, so about 40 power. And I just ran out of the backyard, got a quick hang picture, and that was it. And then put it up on my ETX. Next. Okay. So, but over the years, I've done smartphone astrophotography with all kinds of models, ever improving models of the iPhone. As you can tell, I'm an iPhone. You can also do photography not just through the telescope. You can mount it on a tripod, slip on lenses. Originally, they didn't have the multiple lens smartphones. You can slip on your telephoto lens, slip on a wide angle lens, and do sky photography. And of course, like I say, every tiny app comes out with a new phone, or Google comes out with a new phone. They have improvements both in camera hardware and so. You can also do terrestrial astrophotography, not on urban optics, spotting scope, or even a night scope. I'm looking forward to.
You got to get closer to the microphone.
Sorry
Yeah.
about that. Sorry, people.
By the way, you are being broadcast right now to the Argentina Association of Astronomy in Buenos Aires right now. So,
Welcome, thank you.
yeah.
So you can do that terrestrial kind of stuff, and I'm looking forward to maybe experimenting with the night scope that Explore Scientific is going to have out Saturday night out at the wildlife line. See what we can capture through that with an iPhone. Next. So the easiest way to get started is to just handhold your iPhone, your smartphone, and your phone, whatever it is, right over the eyepiece. The problem with that is next. They'll be limited to brighter objects because you need a fast shutter speed. Next. It's also going to be a challenge to keep the camera centered up over the eyepiece, but you can do it, especially if it's a bright object. Next. But you're going to get this blurring because of your hand motion. You're going to go try to go to a longer exposure to capture maybe moons of Jupiter. It's going to be really hard to keep it steady, but you can do it. I have done. Next, okay. So basic technique is focus the object to your eye. Then put the camera right over the eyepiece. See what you're seeing there on the screen of the iPhone or the smartphone. Let all the exposure do its thing. If that's the only app you have, adjust it if necessary. You can tweak down the exposure levels, many things, especially after the moon, that'll help. You got an app that will do manual exposure settings. That's really what you want to use. And we'll talk more about that. And then you, of course, photograph. Next. So here's some examples of just handheld astrophotography. Crescent moon is very, very young new moon there. Left, Earth shining in the middle, and of course, craters on the moon. Those are easy to capture. It's a perfect way to get started with the first foray into smartphone astrophotography. Next. Venus, this high power eyepiece, get a nice crescent, beautiful shot. Galilean moons are also easy. You may overexpose the planet because you're trying to get the dimmer moons. Next. Picture on the left, clip on 8-power telephoto lens, handheld, grabbing solar clips in 2013, that was partial phase. And then on the right is not so clear in there on the screen, but you can actually see some of the corona, and there's a black dot in the middle that would have been the moon. Next. So, early adapters, early smartphone adapters that I made, is you really do want your phone mounted onto the eyepiece. You don't handle it around all that. So I decided I would make one in 2010. Next. You can do this too. I just took an eyepiece clamp that I had for another digital adapter, digital camera adapter, and I used a piece of 10-gauge rubber-coated wire, which you can see here in the picture. And I just sort of wrapped it around the phone, wrapped the wire around the adapter, the eyepiece clamp, and I had a smartphone adapter. And it actually worked pretty nicely. I decided to tweak it a little bit, and that's this picture here. What I found was it would kind of slip a little bit, so it made it a little bit more secure. So that's an easy smartphone adapter to make, and it works well. Next. Of course, today you might have kinds of different adapters. I'll show you some in a second. Most of the adapters are universal, meaning that they'll fit any size phone. They'll work with any positioning of all the cameras, or with the vertical or at a pattern. And then you can, of course, easily select whether you use a normal lens or called photo lens. So they're called universal and they work well. Some are specific to specific smartphone models, which means the size, the camera placement. Next, well, as you upgrade your smartphone, then you have to go get an adapter in that case. So back up on. So some of them will work as spotting scope for binoculars. So you can become multi-purpose. Some have a tripod mounting hole, which is very handy to just put your smartphone up on a tripod. But you're still gonna have this problem of trying to get the camera lens aligned with the eyepiece. Next, okay. So here's some adapters. This one is an older model, Orion SteadyFix. This particular model has been discontinued, but most of the models, these universal adapters are very similar to this. They only supported up to 1¼ inch eyepieces, a big certain diameter depending on the model. And they didn't have a tripod hole, but if there were holes available or slots available, you can put like a wing nut, 1¼ by 20 wing nut on there, and you can, you know, mount it on a tripod. Next. This adapter from Leavenworth is actually one of my favorite adapters. It does support up to 2-inch eyepieces. It will also go down to the very small 0.965 adapters, which my old Edmund 3-inch telescope had the small eyepieces. So it works well with all that stuff. Got a tripod mounting hole on the bottom of it. And again, because it's universal, meaning it to swing around and you can expand and contract and grab it here. You can mount it on almost any smartphone, and you can put it on all kinds of different devices. You can telescope, you can see binoculars, you can see it's been used on a tripod, binocular handheld there. The picture on the right is just out looking past my observatory towards Kitt Peak Observatory, which is 65 miles away. So with this 8-power binocular, you can actually see the tabletop mountains. And when you have a good view of this thing on your computer, you can actually see the Mayall 4-meter dome sticking up on your feet. So that's the kind of picture you could do with an adapter like this. Next. That's only about $30 for this guy. Next. So this one is from a company called Phone Scope. They call it a digital adapter. It is not cheap, but it has some unique features. Supports eyepieces up to 2 inch. They have separate adapters for binoculars and spotting scopes, etc. They also sell an optional tripod adapter, but you do need a specific case, very similar to your smartphone case that you carry your phone around. So it's specific to the size of your smartphone. It's also specific to, again, where the camera is located. So it comes in 2 pieces, buy them separately. So there's the adapter that clamps onto your eyepiece. This fits down over the case adapter, and you can also select whether you want to use the normal lens or telephoto lens. The nice thing about this is it eliminates that optical alignment problem, because this thing clamps right over the center of your eyepiece, and with the proper case, you're centered. So these are very, very handy for that. Next. So let's real quickly run a bunch of examples. Next. So I mentioned it before, it's easy to do earth sun. Next. Obviously craters and mountain shadows. I love mountain shadows. I'll sit out in my observatory and over 20 minutes or up to an hour, you can watch those shadows. I've done some video movies, movies of those shadows changing. But just as fun. It's fun too. Next. Lunar eclipse last year. Again, all done with smartphone. Mounted on the eyepiece on the telescope. Just a little montage of that. So you get all the colors, easily done. Next, Sunspot with proper solar filter protection. You're okay with that. You can take pictures of asteroids. This was done with an old iPhone 5S many years ago. You can actually get pictures of asteroids if you want to say, hey, I'm photographing asteroids with my smartphone. I love asteroids. I do a lot of asteroid photography. I worked, as you read in my book, I worked when I was an undergraduate for 4 years. And after I graduated from Indiana University, I worked on the Indiana University Astro program, measuring positions of stars and asteroids on 8x10 photographic class flights. So that was awesome. As a student, that was a great job. And they paid me. Next. This was actually the original Chinese space station transiting the sun. Just one iPhone. Next. Mars last during the close opposition a couple of years ago. So we got a pretty good shot of that. A single frame, not a stacked image. Same with Saturn, single frame, not stacked. This was actually the Jupiter-Saturn very, very close conjunction back in 2020. This is a daytime shot. One of the neat things about doing smartphone astrophotography, you can quickly do those quick grab photographs. You can sit in your eyepiece, you can photograph it with the smartphone. So up at the top, you can see the faint Saturn up there, and the bottom. Next. Comets, easily done with a smartphone. Next. Who the ideas? Next. Double cluster, there on the left, you get some of the colors that come out with a smartphone. Alberia, beautiful rendition of the colors there. Easily done, just a few seconds. Next. Globular cluster. From here, you can see Omega Centauri, about 12 degrees or so above the horizon. And 22 globular cluster. Next. Blue Snowball, one of my favorite little nebulae. You got picture, the main picture there on the left is not, that was the baby picture in the IP. So you zoom in and you can see some of the details of the Blue Snowball. Dumbbell nebula there on the right. Thank you. Next. Next. Let's come on Nebula. Again, made the raw picture and then zoomed in there on the top of that. So you can see a lot of the structure. One of my favorite objects there on the right is M46 is an open cluster, and in our line of sight beyond that is a planetary nebula. And I didn't think I was going to capture that when I decided to do it. And you see a live view on your screen, and you say, there it is. Wow, I couldn't believe it. Next. This is kind of fun. If you want to do a neat project, and I have not done it, I'll be honest, is to photograph Hubble's variable nebula over a period of time. Because there are changes that you can take kind of year after year after year. Well, you can photograph with sufficient detail to detect those with a smartphone. Incredible, incredible. Picture there on the left, trip of nebula, just recently taken during one of my rare clear nights this summer. They get all the colors, get a lot of the structure there, and of course they ran into it. Next. Triangle galaxy, very faint galaxy, which from here you can't see with your naked eye. So hopefully one of these nights when you're up here at the park and Andromeda has risen, Pegasus has risen, start seeing, stay up late enough to get it up near the zenith, and I'll bet you can see triangle galaxies with your naked eye. Leo trip of the galaxies. Look, back up. Leo trip of the galaxies. All three of the galaxies are in that picture with a smartphone. Next. Supernova goes off in another galaxy. Grab your smartphone. You can go capture it for posterity. Sunspot nebula there, or Sunspot galaxy on the right. You can actually see the dust laying through the edge of it. Next. Whirlpool galaxy. This is a challenging one to get. Just because of the little surface, right? It's just center of the triangle galaxy. So when I did this one, I was actually surprised that I could get out a lot of that spiral structure and the color with a smartphone. Great. Next. Both galaxy, Cigar galaxy, they're both of them in the same field of view, low power eyepieces. And then on the right is higher magnification. You get the colors in Cigar galaxy and you get the dust line coming up with a smartphone. Pretty amazing. Next. All of those are all done with my 8-inch or then my 12-inch telescope in my observatory, but you can use any telescope. Tracking now help because it keeps things centered in your eyepiece, of course. Next. So I mentioned that Edmonds Scientific 3-inch telescope during a lunar eclipse several years ago. I mounted my iPhone right on it, centered up the moon. Got partial phases going through those. Next. That 70 millimeter refractor, Dumbbell Nebula, Andromeda Galaxy. Andromeda Galaxy is a challenge because the core will overexpose on you, obviously, but you can still get. Next. The ETX 90, my original ETX mounted on a better mount later on. So this was the 1996 optic. Orion Nebula. Next. Neat, 127 millimeter mesostochastic grain. Jupiter, red spot wouldn't even be visible there. Saturn, again, these are all single images, not stacked. And Hercules globular cluster, small object. Next. Got a 102 millimeter totally manual refractor, and you can still do something with that. So it's easy to get the Earth sign on the moon, and of course you can still get in 42. Next. So I mentioned those, some of the smartphone adapters will have a tripod adapter, so you can put your smartphone on like a little umbrella pod there. If you see the picture there in the center, that little 8-car telephoto lens has a solar filter on it from a company called Spectrum Telescope. So that's what I use during the partial phases of the eclipse. And of course, you put it on any sort of tracking method. Next, so here's some examples. These were on a tripod with a particular app that we'll talk about a little bit. So it's Star Trail, you get lots of airplanes. There's a satellite going through there as well. There's a meteor. Picture on the right is the International Space Station rising up over my observatory. Next, that 8-power clip-on lens, you can do things like the Pleiades there on the left, or imported for the beehive cluster on the right. Next, piggyback it on a tracking mount, either a telescope or a dedicated tracking mount. You can do kind of wide angle sky photography. You see Orion there on the left, zodiacal light, or if you prefer zodiacal. I prefer zodiacal because it's the zodiac. Anyway, that is visible from here. And so this time of the year, it'll be open in the morning. So you can sit back, see it from here. This was an evening shot. We do get it, you can get that with your smartphone. Picture on the right is again a wide angle view. Right in the center is N31, and then that's a magnified view. Next. Piggybacking again on the telescope, you can sit there at the eyepiece and guide. So you can kind of do those longer exposures. That's what I'm showing there. Next. Of course, you piggyback anything. So I had a little bit of fun one night and piggybacked a pair of binoculars on my telescope and shot through one of the lenses of the binoculars. And so again, I got the Leo trip of the galaxies as seen through the binoculars. Next. Briefly, let's talk about video recording next. When you're imaging planets with a smartphone, you can take advantage of video. That's really about the only time that you're going to find it advantageous to do video recording. Next. So what you're to get out of that is hundreds, maybe thousands of video frames, especially if your smartphone will be like the iPhone does, 240 frames per second. When it's in seconds, you're going to get 2,400 frames. Next. Then you can stack all those frames or stack the best frames if you want to go to what the imaging, and you can get some pretty good pictures. Okay, so here's Venus, very thin crescent Venus. Sorry, John, no action lights. I'm going to try though one of these days. Read his book about action, Mystery of Action Light. It's just an interesting, fascinating story. We had some conversations about that. Anyway, Mars, they're doing the opposition 2020. You see some of the details there, the polar cap, the polar hood there at the top. Next. Jupiter and Saturn, very good spot. You see division, ring there with Saturn. Next. So let's talk about apps. So you buy your smartphone, you get a camera app of some sort. Generally speaking, that's not going to work for astrophotography. There are some exceptions to that. But it's not going to have an intervalometer mode. You're not going to program it in any sort of way. There's no special modes for long exposure or very special things that you might want to do. So there are, in fact, much more capable apps for both Android and iPhone. Next. So these are some examples of Android apps that I found. Again, I'm not an Android user, but they are up on the Google Play Store. Deep Sky Camera, Astro Cam, they will give you full capabilities over your exposure, shutter speed, ISO, white balance, that kind of stuff. Some of these apps for the Android side will actually do like on the iPhone, started on the iPhone, image stacking on the device. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the next. So on the iPhone side, iCap camera, that's the one I recommend, $3. Right now, the most capable, feature-rich, exotic program to do any type of astrophotography with an iPhone. And I will tell you that I've been beta tested for this guy since, I don't know, 2005 or something, no, 2000. 10, yes, it was. It's a wonderful app, a lot of capabilities or things that I had suggested to the guy, the developer, but it is an incredible app. A couple of other interesting apps that are free are StarCam and Milky Cam. In these apps are really unique. They do image stacking. They also do dark frame, a whole bunch of other stuff. But the neatest thing that these two apps do is star registration, even on non-tracking maps. So what you do is you center up your object in the IDs and on your screen, you start the exposure and you watch the object drift across the field of view. As it gets as far as close to the edge of field of view as you want to deal with, you then pause the image and move it back over, maybe move it to the other side of center, restart the image, and it starts going across. And what it does is it finds stars in the field of view and registers those stars. And derotates. For free. It's pretty impressive. Learning curve on those two apps is pretty steep. It will take you a lot of practice. There is a learning curve for nightcap camera, but it's much easier to get into than this other two. So what those two free apps can do, it's pretty mind-blowing. Next. So here's the user interface for nightcap camera. As I said, it gives you control over everything. So you put your object there on the screen and you touch all the various buttons. Next. So you adjust all the settings with little sliders. You just slide your finger around the various edges of the screen. You're going to adjust shutter speed, ISO, white balance, focus. Next. So typically with this app, depending on the iPhone model, you're going to go from a very, very low ISO for bright objects up to ISO 32,000, a real ISO 32,000. Oh my, the grain. No, not that bad, surprisingly. Shutter speed goes from 1 second, although with the current phones, some of the older phones were 30th of a second shutter speed or a half-second shutter speed. Full white balance range, full focus range, which you need to worry about. There are some automatic modes that use artificial intelligence to try to adjust the pictures. You can't turn that off, but once you make a change, then it's off. Next. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. There's this thing called light boost, which is really pumping up the gain. And there's noise reduction, which I leave off. I let myself on the computer take care of that. You can do black and white imaging if you want. There's a whole slew of these special modes. Long exposure, if you do guided imaging, that's pictures to try to make the starting point. There's an ISS mode where it starts taking pictures in the sky and builds up the trail of the ISS past the sky. And if you're on a tracking mount, then your stars are still pinpoint. They're not trail. There is also the Star Trail mode, which is really fun. Mount your iPhone on a camera, on a tripod, and start the exposure. Run it for as long as you want to. If you got a power supply connected to the iPhone, then you'll watch the star trails build up on the screen as the sky rotates. Really kind of cool. And then you of course see all the airplanes. There's this other neat mode which can work. Well, some people have not had a lot of success with it. There's this meteor mode. So if you got a good meteor shower, what you do is put your iPhone on a tripod, aim up the sky, start imaging. What it does, it takes a picture. Are there any streaks? Nope, no streaks. Put that image out. Oh, got a picture of a streak. Save that. And so every time it takes an exposure, which is automatic, it looks to see if there's any streaks. So really faint meteors, it won't work. But if it's a moderately bright meteor, then you can start building up a collection of images with meteors. So when it works really nice. It's a lot of fun. Next. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. You can turn on the geotaging so that you know when the picture was taken. Have grids on the screen, different photo qualities, a normal JPEG, a high quality JPEG, and a TIFF file. You like to deal with TIFF files in the post-processing. You can do a delay on the self-timer if you need to. And it does have this full capability intervalometer. You can set up exposure length, how long you want, how many pictures you want to take, all this stuff. And it also supports the remote shut. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Next. So again, what it does is it stacks all those images on the device, whether you're doing long exposures of M42, or whether you're doing satellite pictures or star treks, it stacks everything on the device. You do not get access to all those individual images. Next. Oh, did point out there, this app does not, in its current version, do star registration. So you need pretty active. Next. So I've been mentioning you're going to use tripod whenever you're doing kind of sky stuff. Again, the ISS mode builds it up, makes this nice trail through the sky, and we've already talked about that. Next. So typical exposure is kind of important to know. So if we're just taking pictures, wide angle night sky, you're going to have sort of a moderate ISO setting, and pictures are going to be anywhere from less than a second, maybe out to hours. Taking the moon, again, low ISO because it's bright, typically a short shutter speed. You want to capture Earth's shining colors, either increase the ISO or lengthen the exposure. For planets, it's pretty low if it's a bright planet, up to something medium, and again, long exposure to short exposure, depending on the brightness. For stars, again, depending on how bright the stars are, you're going to use a wide range of exposure settings. For deep sky objects, so things you're going to want to have is light boost, pretty high ISO if it's a faint object, and again, you're going to take advantage of your slow shutter speed, whether it's 1 second or half second, and then take the exposure as long as you need to. One of the things that I've discovered in all my testing and use of this app, you don't really gain anything from going beyond 1 minute exposure. Next. So this thing called high ISO and light boost, which is a setting. You can get some noise out of it on the older iPhones, but on the current models, you hardly get any noise with these settings on. So typically, I'm for very faint galaxies and great nebulae, I'm using an ISO of 32,000 on my iPhone 13 Pro Max, and I have that light boost on. Of course, as with any digital photography or any photography, if you reduce the ISO, you can get some better images. You can turn on light boost, you may get some better images. So you kind of have to play with your model phone and the objects you're trying to photograph to see which way it's going to look. Next, Apple camera app. So back on iOS 13, their built-in camera app had this night mode. They hold the camera up to a dark scene, and the little indicator pops up in yellow, and it typically defaults to 3 seconds. And again, what it does is it takes multiple images and stacks them on the device. So you're sitting there hand holding or on a tripod, and you can adjust that speed a little bit, somewhere between up to 10 seconds, maybe 30 seconds, depending on your phone model and how dark it is. What it's doing is, of course, high dynamic. Deep side, HDR. Next. Unfortunately, you can't turn it off. But you can't turn it on because it's automatically turned on. The only way you can turn it off is to slide exposure length down to off. Next. So, but it, like I said, it can do anywhere from 3 to 30 seconds. Next. Next, there. So, this built-in app does make nice sky astrophotos possible. Next. So, it works great on the Orion Nebula, lots of colors, lots of nice crisp stars there. Next. A bunch of tips. I'm going to run through a whole slew of tips here really quick. So, we talk about, when you're hand holding, things can move around. If you tap the screen, they tap the shutter button on the screen, you can create a vibration, especially out on a lightweight tripod with a telescope. You tap the screen, telescope jiggles around. So use the camera app self-timer. That's one way to avoid the vibration. You can use the hat trick method, which I'm sure many of you do, holding this obstruction out in front of your telescope lens. Start to open the shutter, pull the card away, close it back down, stop the shutter. Of course, with the iPhone, you can use little earbud earbuds as a shutter release. The volume control button is a shutter button.
No.
Does it work with the wireless one, you know?
Or you can use an Apple Watch, start shot the exposures, and Bluetooth connected remote shutters do work. There's that one there with the green background, that's a little Bluetooth. And that'll work. One of the things you have to worry about is controlling the volume instead of tripping the shutter. And many of the apps have trouble with that, including Night Air Camera. And it's kind of just built into the OS. There's two ways to get around it. If volume up button doesn't work, there's the volume down button. And usually that will tell the system, I'm really talking to the shutter, not the speaker. Or take a picture by touching the screen on the shutter button, and then that resets the system and says, now you can use this again. Sometimes you have to exit the app and go right back. But this is a handy way to have a remote shutter, so if you don't have a Bluetooth. Next. Of course, getting that camera lens lined up over the eyepiece with one of these universal adapters where you get your phone mounted, you're trying to get things all centered out distance-wise from the eyepiece, that can be a challenge. So ways to do that better is point it at some light, or point the light into the telescope so you can illuminate the field of view. Sometimes it may require you to, depending on what your light source is, mount this onto the eyepiece, have your phone on it, pull the eyepiece out of the telescope, aim it at some light. Like in my observatory, I have the red rope lighting around the floor, so I'll aim it down there. If you got a bright object, you don't have to do this. But when you're trying to get a very big galaxy, you do want to be centered over the eyepiece. Next. Again, when you're mounting this thing, this separation from the eyepiece, height relief distance out to where the camera lens is important. I'll show you some examples of that. So that's something else you can have to play with is the spacing. So you slide your eyepieces here, you slide the adapters up or down one or two of the eyepiece, get that proper spacing. So here's some examples of that. So here we're too far away. We don't get the full field of view of the eyepiece there in the upper left-hand corner. Over on the right, we get too close. So in the case of Schmidt-Cassegrain type telescope, we have the obstruction with the secondary lens, the secondary mirror. You can start getting some shadow effects. A little bit better down there in the lower left-hand corner, but there on the right, we've got pretty much the full field of view evenly illuminated. Next. So here's some examples of that. Centaurus A galaxy, which is also visible from here, which is a lot of fun. So, and again, an iPhone. So you can see we're not quite lined up optically because you get all this variable illumination in the field of view, especially if we're on the one on the right. Next. So here we are in pretty good shape showing Centaurus galaxy. Everything is lined up properly. Next. More tip. Bright objects, whether it's the moon, planet Venus, sometimes Jupiter, may overexpose as we're typically using an auto exposure control kind of map like built-in camera apps. So if you can't get the image brightness reduced down to shutter speed, like so, throw a filter on. Whether it's a moon filter, a polarizing filter, or something like that. And that will now allow you to better control the exposure. You can zoom in with your digital zoom to check your focus. A lot of times the camera apps will try to do autofocus, and it won't be quite as accurate as eyeballing. So if you have manual focus control in your app, zoom in, get your stars to be nice pinpoints, and then zoom back out for your image. If the app allows, we certainly do lock all the exposure settings, not just the focus. On some adapters, you can leave the rubber eyepiece up there on the eyepiece. Other adapters are going to require you to take it off. It just depends on the adapter style. Because a lot of times leaving it on can benefit to keep stray light from your camera lens. One of the things you have to worry about, there's lots of multiple reflections going on. So any light that's going to hit the eyepiece glass and bounce up into your camera lens, and depending on the angles, it may bounce off the camera lens back down to the eyepiece glass. So you have to watch out for those reflected lights. Next. So, back up. So low magnification obviously gives you maximum image brightness. So you want to do that for anything that's very faint. Higher magnification, anything's basically has a lot of stars, lots of clusters, open clusters, you can get away with the higher magnification. And some of those bright planetary nebulas you can also, or even like in 42. Again, I mentioned by keeping the eyepiece kind of attached. Next. So you all know what those stones are. Those are doing afocal imaging through the eyepiece. If your eyepiece is dirty, you're going to mess up your picture, like you can see there on the right of all the dots. If you're using digital zoom because you want to get a bigger image, you may or may not get a better image than what you would have had at a 1x magnification. So use the zoom with a little bit of caution. Typically better off using a 1x magnification and then crop it, magnify it in your cell phone. One of the things you want to be certain to do is be certain that the eyepiece is firmly secured in the clamp of the eyepiece and that your phone is securely secured in its mount. Otherwise, be certain your phone's secure because it will fall out of here, especially as the telescope slews around and now the phone is sitting here on this side of the adapter. So if you weren't certain it was secure over here, bang, you just dropped your phone on the floor. It's digital photography. Experiment, experiment, experiment. Throw away the bad ones. Next. So let's quickly talk about this a little bit. Back in the iPhone 12 model, Apple got smart and said, we're going to give people low light photography capability, and we want to be able to illuminate an area to find out how far away the object is. So we're going to use this LiDAR, laser distance imaging thing. So, okay, so useful, like I say, for low light imaging. They also use it for 3D stuff where they're doing scanning and things like that. Next. But it adds stray lights. When I first saw this, when I got my iPhone 13, I had an iPhone 11 before that, and I got my iPhone 13 last year. I said, where do all these flying saucers come from? I'm sitting there trying to image the Eagle Nebula, which you can actually see there. But there were all these purple lights coming up onto my image. And I'm like, what the heck is all this? So I did lots of fussing around and discovered, in fact, that it was the LiDAR sensor blasting out this light in the back of the phone. Next, you can't turn it off. Apple is not giving us as users or developers a way to turn that off. I complained. I've got connections in Apple. Developers complain, but still can't turn it off. Next. So what you do is you cover the LiDAR part, which is the little black opening down here on this phone. And next. So the solution was to make something like that covers up. Since there is the LiDAR sensor. Problem is now you got to keep that on there while you're imaging. So what I use is kind of flips. You see there. Next. So very briefly on imaging editing, you log out image editing apps for photos, copy converter, Lightroom, Photoshop, whatever. So that's where you're going to deal with things like stretching, adjusting the levels, sharpening, do some noise reduction, or color adjustment. It's a lot more. Next. Of course, once you've got that best image from your smartphone, you're going to do that editing. You get levels and sharpening with smartphone astrophotography are the two simplest and most important things to do. Just so you go next. So here is a raw shot of the moon, big photo. On the right is the levels adjustment. That's the program called Graphic Converter, which is shareware for $35. It's very similar to Photoshop. Very, very powerful outside Photoshop. So you see the raw image there. And what we're going to do is move what's called the shoulder sliders. They're in the level graph to where it reaches the shoulder. You see that next. So what we've done here is we've taken that right little pointer there on the graph, moved it back to where the data shows, that's the shoulder. And that brightens up the image and increases contrast really nicely. So back up one. So you see the difference there. That pretty much makes a nice dramatic difference. Next. There we go. So here we've done some sharpening adjustments. Don't go overboard with this because it'll look terrible. But if you do a little bit, you can get some really nice sharpening. The backup one. So you can see the difference there. Graders and mixed graders. Next. Okay, so like I'm saying up there, astrophotography has never been as easy or as fun as it is today. You don't have to deal with all the glass plates, take an hour-long exposure, drop the glass plate, come back up on the next time. Anyway, next. Good. So all those expensive imagers, you got an imager in your pocket. I'm gonna use it next. Okay, just a quick final image, flame nebula. Don't know the smartphone, obviously. Running Man nebula. Next. Horsehead nebula. Right. I was a little surprised that I got it, but I did. Next.
Is that a single exposure?
Single exposure. Like that.
Which was your 12-inch?
The 12. Yeah. The bummer is when I had my 8-inch guest screen from here, I could see the horsehead nebula without any filters. The 12-inch, I had yet to see it. My eyes are getting old.
What?
Hmm?
With the 12, what happens?
Can't see it. I have not been able to see the horsehead. My eyes are getting older too. Okay, basically, if you can see it in the eyepiece, you can probably photograph it with a smartphone, which is a neat capability that you all have with your smartphones. So start doing astrophotography with your smartphone. Questions? Yeah.
Small piece of gas table that I got for.
It would. I just avoided putting anything that was sticky around the camera.
That's why I got.
Yeah, I know. I did, yeah, all the painter stays, that kind of stuff. Yeah. I didn't have any, so that's why I used those little clip ons. And again, I had originally thought about what could I tape on around the camera. And didn't have any gaffer stage or painter stage, so I'll just do that. And it works. Anything else? Yeah.
Like, how significant is the noise in these detectors, and are you seeing that improving with multiple generations?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I went from my older generations of phones to the iPhone 11 Pro Max, up to 2+ years ago, dramatic improvement in two cases. One, the older iPhones had a shutter speed limit of either 1/3 of a second or 1/2 a second, which means you weren't getting a lot of light onto the sensor. The newer phones, starting with the iPhone 10s, gave you a 1 second shutter speed. So you were capturing, 3 times more light or twice more light. So a significant improvement in that standpoint. The pixel density on the phones have been improving, which has been improving the noise reduction. And like I say, maybe the apps you can turn on noise reduction. I go and do that. I love my software. Decide how much noise reduction I want to do. But I've been doing a lot of now with my iPhone 15 Pro Max, ISO 32,000. And if you brighten them way up, you're going to see a lot of noise. But if you do a normal looking exposure to your eye, noise is very minimal. It's been an amazing transition from all that original older stuff to where they are today. Amazing cameras. So another question?
I was just gonna ask, did you have trouble with the weight of the Max size phones? Because I tried it a little while back, my old Max, and slipping in.
Certainly, as the iPhone's got a little bit heavier, or even Android phones as well. That's why you really do need to secure things down either on the eyepiece or the mounting bracket that holds the phone. You may have to add something else if it's the phone slipping in its adapter, or if the eyepiece clamp is rotating around the eyepiece as you're changing to different pointing directions. That's again why you want to worry about, is the phone going to fall out? That could be a challenge. It also depends on your mount. Is your mount with a telescope not so flimsy that things are going to slip around? But
I actually have put this got the regular sensors. That's good. So I did less of that issue, I hope.
Okay. Yeah, certainly the smaller size phones, lower weight, that's going to be less of an issue. I haven't had that particular issue, but the reason I stress this, secure your phone, or insure it, because mine did fall out. One of my iPhones many, many years ago actually slipped out of the mount, fell down onto the floor of my observatory. My observatory floor is covered with carpet, in case I ever dropped anything. So it's, but yeah, that's one thing you do want to worry about. Yeah.
You find that any adapter works better? I mean, I've tried a number of adapters, and you're right, it's a real pain in the neck to get it flush, keep it still.
Sure thing. This 11 hook adapter, $30, is my preferred adapter.
I'm sorry.
It's called 11 hook. Levenhuk. B&H Photo has them in stock right now, I heard. Just heard that last week. First now there's going to be a run on them. They won't have any more, so order quickly. This is my preferred adapter. 11 hook, HUK.
Yeah, the guy that was into microscopy in the 1600s. Also pronounced.
Similar, not quite.
Yeah.
But this one goes up to very large 2-inch eyepieces. I put this on my Explorer Scientific 100-degree 9mm eyepiece.
Yeah.
Which has a 2.4 outside diameter or something like that. And this is a clamp on. So unfortunately, as Scott knows, it doesn't clamp on my 14mm 100-degree. Because I would really like to use that for some mounted astrophotography. So I don't have a mount. But this is really my preferred one. If I am worried about Yachty being so faint, and I even can't see it on the screen, I'm gonna try to image it, I have to worry about that optical alignment problem. So just because I'm lazy, I use this phone scope, digoscope to do that with its automatic centering. But again, this is going to cost you in the neighborhood of $100 for the size. So it's called Phone Scope, SKOPE. And like there, you have to go on their system and specify what phone model you have, what eyepiece adapter, whether you want the small ones or the larger ones. But the case is the important part. And then when you upgrade your phone, get something larger or different camera placements, you have to get a new case. The eyepiece adapter still works. Next. Okay, well, I've kind of eaten into your lunch hour a little bit because our next talk is at 1 o'clock, I think. So thank you all. Yep. Thank you, Scott.
1:30.
1:30 now, okay?
1:30. It's always good 1:30.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So we had an hour and a half of lunch, now we have 54 minutes.
All right. So thanks for being a part of our session. Now those of you that are watching on our live stream, come back in about an hour, 54 minutes or so, 1:30 Arizona time is when we'll be back. So thanks and stay tuned.
What do you want?